In August of 1914, soldiers marched to war in bright uniforms with swords on their hips. Cavalry officers led charges on horseback. Generals planned campaigns using tactics that had barely changed since Napoleon. Every major European power believed this war would be short, glorious, and decided by courage and cold steel. They were about to discover how catastrophically wrong they were. 4 years later, those bright uniforms were buried in mud, the horses were dead, the swords were useless, and the generals who had promised a short war had presided over the deaths of 20 million people. World War I did not just kill a generation, it invented an entirely new way of killing, one that every war since has been built on. This is the story of 6 weapons that turned the Great War into the first modern war, and every one of them is still killing people today. Artillery was not new in 1914, but what was new was the scale. The Industrial Revolution had made it possible to manufacture millions of shells and thousands of heavy guns. By 1916, a single bombardment could fire more ammunition in 1 week than entire wars had consumed in previous centuries. At the Battle of Verdun, the Germans fired over 2 million shells in the opening bombardment alone. The ground shook for miles. Entire forests were reduced to splinters. The landscape of northeastern France was permanently scarred, and in some places, the craters from 1916 are still visible today. Here is the single most important fact about World War I. Artillery killed more soldiers than any other weapon. Not machine guns, not gas, not bayonets. Shell fire accounted for roughly 60% of all combat deaths in the entire war. The machine gun gets the reputation. Artillery did the actual killing. Artillery is the reason the trenches existed. Soldiers dug into the earth because staying above ground meant death. The deeper you dug, the better your chances of surviving a bombardment. German dugouts on the Somme were sometimes 30 feet deep, reinforced with concrete and timber. They could survive almost anything, which is why, when British infantry walked across no man's land expecting the German defenders to be dead, they found them very much alive, climbing out of their bunkers to man their machine guns. But in World War I, its full horror was revealed. A single Vickers gun could fire over 500 rounds per minute across a fixed arc of fire. One gun, operated by a crew of just 2 men, could cover an entire section of no man's land. Any soldier who stood up in that arc was dead. The mathematics were simple and devastating. The machine gun made defense far more powerful than attack. A handful of guns could stop a 1,000-man charge. And they did, over and over and over again for 4 straight years. On the morning of July 1st, 1916, the British Army launched the Battle of the Somme. For 7 days before the attack, British artillery had pounded the German positions with over 1.5 million shells. The generals were certain the bombardment had destroyed the German defences. They were so confident that they ordered their infantry to walk, not run, across no man's land, carrying 66 pounds of equipment per man. But the German machine gunners had survived in their deep bunkers. When the British walked into the open, the guns opened fire. In a single day, the British Army suffered 57,470 casualties. Nearly 20,000 were killed. Most died in the first hour. It remains the bloodiest day in British military history. At 5 o'clock on the afternoon of April 22nd, 1915, the German army opened 6,000 canisters of pressurized chlorine gas along a 4-mile front near Ypres, Belgium. 168 tons of poison rolled across no man's land in a thick yellow-green cloud. The French-Algerian troops holding the line had never seen anything like it. Their officers, mistaking it for a smokescreen, ordered men forward into the gas. Chlorine combines with moisture in the lungs to form hydrochloric acid. Within minutes, thousands of soldiers were choking, blinded, drowning in the fluid filling their own lungs. One soldier who survived described it as an equivalent death to drowning, only on dry land. The gas attack opened a 5-mile hole in the Allied line. 10,000 soldiers were affected. Half of them died within 10 minutes, asphyxiated in their own trenches, where the heavier-than-air chlorine pooled in the lowest points. Those who survived were blinded, their lungs seared. Lines of blinded men shuffled to the rear, each gripping the shoulder of the man in front. But the German infantry, stunned by the effectiveness of their own weapon and lacking reserves, failed to exploit the gap. They advanced cautiously through the lingering gas, and by the time Canadian reinforcements arrived, using urine-soaked handkerchiefs pressed over their faces as improvised gas masks, the line was stabilized. After Ypres, both sides raced to develop their own gases and their own defenses. The Allies were outraged and then deployed their own chemical weapons within months. Chlorine was followed by phosgene, which was invisible and 18 times more deadly. Then came mustard gas, which didn't just attack the lungs but burned any exposed skin, blinding soldiers and leaving chemical burns that took weeks to heal. Mustard gas could contaminate an area for days, making it impossible to occupy captured trenches. By the end of the war, both sides had fired over 100,000 tons of chemical agents. Gas accounted for roughly 91,000 deaths and over 1 million casualties. The flamethrower was Germany's terror weapon. First deployed in February 1915 at Malancourt, and then used extensively at Verdun and the Somme, the flamethrowers shot a jet of burning fuel up to 36 meters. In the confined space of a trench, it was devastating and psychologically shattering. Soldiers who had endured machine gun fire and artillery bombardment for months would break and run at the sight of liquid fire. The weapon was so feared that captured flamethrower operators were often killed on the spot. Over the course of the war, Germany deployed 3,000 Flammenwerfer troops and conducted over 650 attacks. The flamethrower's fatal flaw was that carrying it was nearly suicidal. The operator was the most visible and most targeted man on the battlefield. The fuel tanks on his back were a bullet away from turning him into a human torch. Flamethrower operators had some of the highest casualty rates of any specialty in the war. The weapon terrorized, but it consumed its own users almost as efficiently as it consumed the enemy. By 1916, the Western Front was a problem without a solution. Machine guns made attacking suicidal. Artillery could destroy defenses but also destroyed the ground the attackers needed to cross. Gas was unpredictable and could blow back on the attackers. Both sides were trapped. The British War Office began searching for a machine that could cross no man's land, survive machine gun fire, and crush barbed wire, something that could restore offensive capability to a war that had become a static killing contest. On September 15, 1916, 49 Mark I tanks rolled toward the German lines at Flers-Courcelette during the Battle of the Somme. Most broke down. The early tanks were mechanically fragile, deafeningly loud, and unbearably hot inside. But the ones that reached the German trenches caused something that years of bombardment had not: panic. German soldiers who had held their positions under millions of shells broke and ran at the sight of grinding, bulletproof steel monsters crawling toward them. The tanks crushed barbed wire, crossed trenches, and shrugged off machine gun fire. A British pilot flying overhead reported seeing a tank walking up the high street of the village of Flers with the British Army cheering behind it. The real proof of concept came at Cambrai in November 1917. Nearly 500 tanks attacked together for the first time, the first massed armoured assault in history. In a single morning, they achieved what 3 years of infantry attacks had failed to do. They broke through the Hindenburg Line, Germany's strongest defensive position. Church bells rang in England to celebrate, the first time they had rung for a victory in the entire war. The breakthrough was eventually lost to a German counterattack because the technology wasn't mature enough to exploit the opening. But the lesson was clear: the tank could break the stalemate. The trench system was no longer invincible. The aeroplane arrived at the front in 1914 as little more than a flying telescope, unarmed scouts who observed enemy positions and reported back. Pilots on opposing sides would sometimes wave to each other. That courtesy died quickly. Within months, pilots were shooting at each other with pistols and rifles. Then machine guns were mounted on the planes. Then the Germans invented a synchronization gear that allowed a machine gun to fire directly through the spinning propeller without hitting the blades. In 4 short years, the aeroplane evolved from a fragile novelty into a weapon system that included fighters, bombers, and ground attack aircraft. Aviation went from zero to lethal in a single war. In June 1917, German Gotha bombers flew over London and dropped bombs on civilians. It was the first strategic bombing raid on a major city. The physical damage was limited, but the psychological impact was enormous. For the first time in history, a nation's civilian population was directly under attack from the air. The concept of total war, where the distinction between soldier and civilian dissolves, was born over London in 1917. That concept would reach its full, terrible expression in the next war, with the firebombing of Tokyo and Dresden, and ultimately with the atomic bomb. When the armistice was signed on November 11, 1918, approximately 20 million people were dead, 10 million soldiers and 10 million civilians. Another 23 million soldiers had been wounded. On the Western Front alone, the trenches stretched for 400 miles and consumed the lives of millions of men for 4 years. And the weapons that made it possible, machine guns, heavy artillery, poison gas, flamethrowers, tanks, and aircraft, did not disappear when the war ended. They were refined, improved, and mass-produced. Every one of them returned in the next war, deadlier than before. The First World War was the laboratory where modern warfare was invented. The machine gun taught armies to dig in. The artillery taught them to dig deeper. Gas taught them that the rules of war could be broken. The flamethrower taught them that terror was a weapon. The tank taught them that the stalemate could be broken. And the aeroplane taught them that nowhere, not even a civilian's home, was safe. Every weapon system used in World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and every conflict since traces a direct line back to the muddy, blood-soaked trenches of 1914 to 1918. In the spring after the armistice, something unexpected happened in the devastated landscape of Flanders. In the mud where millions had fought and died, red poppies bloomed. They were among the first plants to grow back in the churned, shell-torn earth. A Canadian officer named John McCrae, who had treated the wounded at Ypres, had written about them in a poem published during the war. Those poppies became the enduring symbol of the conflict, a reminder that even in the most destroyed landscape, something can grow back. But the weapons born in those trenches never stopped growing, they only got more efficient.